U.S. President Donald Trump claimed he's completely canceling former President Obama's Cuba policy. While he fulfilled a campaign promise, doesn't really translate to presidential policy. Dan Perkins is a businessman and commentator. Dan, we just heard Cubans. They're worried about the possible impact of restricting travel and trade to the island. You're in Florida, the U.S. state closest to Cuba. From your perspective, what might this mean for those industries in that state?
That's a great question, Mike. Let me follow your question, however, with a big picture question. Well, all we have heard for the last 40 minutes is how American tourism might affect the economy of Cuba. If Americans are the only one going there and they are the largest percentage of tourism, why isn't the rest of the world going there? And why isn't the Cuban economy diversifying based on other nations throughout the world? Is it totally dependent upon America? Well, what about all the times when Americans couldn't go to Cuba, other countries? So the idea that we as a nation are going to punish the Cuban people because we're going to restrict some tourism, not all tourism, are we going to damage the economy? Is that so important in 2 years since this agreement has been in place? I also think reporters are saying that Mr. Trump is not canceling everything. You know, you can still get Cuban cigars and you can still buy Cuban rum, and I want the franchise that brings the 1957 Chevys out of there when things get back to normal. It just seems to me that we're pounding on America without knowing the facts how important American tourism is to the Cuban economy. In addition...
Well, Dan, let me continue the conversation because I want to bring in Cristina Escobar into our discussion. Cristina, you're a journalist and commentator in Havana. Let's pick up on this. I mean, Dan's saying, you know, what about it's just all American tourism, which is not the case, obviously. But when you see a 50% increase in tourism from the United States, and that might slide, that is going to impact any economy. I want to get your perspective on what happened today.
We did have a broad market for tourism for a lot of nationalities, people from around the world. Our first market is specifically Canada. But of course, the Cuban tourism industry received very well the amount of American visitors because they're not tourists because of the law that bans tourism to Cuba. Nevertheless, it was important. The main the advantages were around exactly transportation, private and state-run, and Airbnb is the fastest growing market for Airbnb is Cuba specifically. So definitely it's going to impact because it creates a dissuasive effect. Definitely it's going to be harder and more expensive to come to Cuba. It used to be easier. Obama made things easier, and now it's going to be like it used to be before Obama. You had to deliver a full program. You had to be strictly related to one of the categories, and it was much easier. And now it's going to be if the regulations, when the regulations are actually written, because we haven't seen the regulations. They're not published. They're not even done yet. But these regulations will mean that tourism is going to be much harder, and visiting Cuba is going to be much harder for Americans. So we might expect a decreasing number. Nevertheless, Cuba is quite interesting, and there's a genie out of the bottle that Cuba is interesting, that is safe, that you can come, and it's going to be fun. So a lot of Americans would want to come to Cuba, but still it's going to be expensive. Still you're going to need a permission, and you can be audited by your own government because of what you do in Cuba and how much money you spend. And supposedly you're not supposed to spend money in a state-run places, which is practically impossible because the airport is public. Because transportation enterprises, the majority of them are public. Nevertheless, we do have a lot of private initiatives in this sense, but it's going to be impacted. Nevertheless, American tourism is not our first, not even the most important market for Cuban tourism, but we're watching, and essentially private workers are very worried about this.
Dan, Dan, I just want to ask, you know, recently we did a story on young people in Cuba who are learning English for the first time because of the boom in tourism, and you could see new vistas for them. The Telegraph did a piece on the one-year anniversary on this thaw. It begins this way: the past 12 months have seen more changes in Cuba than arguably over the previous 12 years. Are you afraid at all that this move by Trump might actually be worse in terms of the relations between the U.S. and Cuba, and perhaps worse for the people of Cuba?
No, I'm not. I really believe that the Cuban people, if I can believe what I heard today, that the elections that are going to come up to replace Mr. Castro, if there are new young people coming up who are opposed to the communist regime. I think that if that were to happen, and you had a fundamental shift in the philosophy of the Cuban government, it would excite the people, and it would excite the American government, as Mr. Tillerson said, for opportunities not only to travel, but to move businesses and grow a dramatic economy in Cuba.
Cristina, what about that? I mean, if Donald Trump's plan goes forward, it obviously is good news domestically here to his base. But just like the embargo, you know, it's not really aimed at a government when you're doing this sort of thing. Isn't it the people themselves that feel the brunt of it? I mean, are they likely to be more pro-American after this?
The American culture is part of our reality. I always say that I learned English listening to American music and watching to American movies. American culture is part of our reality, and there's not a sense of hate towards the American people. And now, even when you ask the people about this, it's about Trump, about Marco Rubio, which is a Cuban that we're not proud of, a Cuban which was not born in Cuba and hasn't visited Cuba. But definitely, there are people that don't want the good for the Cuban people. It's not accurate to believe that because you're doing this policy, you're actually helping the Cuban people. It's a contradiction. It's impossible to see it like that. And they're trying to use it as a political tool for political aspirations.
And Dan, the embargo was put in place back in February of 1962. I mean, if it was to have the effect that people say it would, wouldn't we have already seen results?
Well, the question I have to ask you is, who says we haven't seen results? I
Well,
mean, you've got
you.
Just me? I don't think it's just me.
Well, I would say
think
that you feel as though there hasn't been enough change, right?
Yes, I agree. And I think the people that were in Miami today who supported what the president said and have been supporting regime change in Cuba for 50 years believe that their country is not their country at the moment, and they'd like to have it back. They want to go back to the way it was. Whether that's good or bad, only the people can determine it. But they know that they have lost their homeland and they want to get it back.
Cristina, is that the sentiment there in Cuba?
Well, definitely there's a sense in Cuba that this is not the approach. The Cuban-American community is not the one that was today at this theater. The vast majority wants normalization with Cuba, wants lifting the embargo. They want to come back and forth. This policy isolates in the very first place to the U.S. And it's very interesting because the President Trump did not speak about how much benefit does the U.S. citizens see in the relation that Obama tried to build, the potential money that a lot of businessmen, essentially in the agricultural sector, could make out of this. All the potential around the economic gains in this sense is something that is not important for Donald Trump. And I don't believe that understanding the Cuban-American community only by this representation today around Donald Trump is not accurate, because it's much more broader, it's much more diverse. There's a new generation, there's a lot of people in that community that think differently, that they don't just want peace and respect between both countries. And I believe that's something that eventually it's going to happen anyway, because I still believe that Trump is a circumstance, which is a reversal, but it's a circumstance. It's not something that we will see forever, because the sense in the majority of the voices is around that. And Marco Rubio, as I told you, is using this for his political aspirations. He hasn't been in Cuba ever, he doesn't know Cuba, and this policy is the demonstration of this, that he doesn't understand Cuba, and he's using the idea for gaining votes and for just going up in the politics in that country.
Cristina Escobar in Havana, Dan Perkins joining us from Tampa. Thank you both for providing your analysis.